Hey there, future diplomats. We know you UPSC hopefuls are out there, especially those of you taking on international relations.
A bold choice.
It is. And speaking of IR, there's one thinker you can't avoid.
Oh, absolutely.
John Stuart Mill.
He's practically everywhere.
He is. And today, we're diving into one of his most fascinating works,
Let me guess.
The Subjection of Women.
Ah, a classic. And a controversial one for its time.
Oh, definitely. Get
Mhm.
this, he compares the situation of women to, well, slavery.
Whoa. That's a pretty bold statement, especially in the 19th century.
It is. So how did he even arrive at such a comparison? I mean, wasn't Mill a product of his time too?
Well, yeah, he was, but that's what makes him so interesting. He takes these classic liberal ideas, freedom, individual rights,
Yeah.
and he applies them systematically to the lives of women. He argues that if these principles are truly universal, then they have to apply to everyone.
Makes sense. Regardless of gender.
Exactly. It's like he's saying, look, you can't preach freedom and equality while denying it to half the population.
Right. So that's where the comparison to slavery comes in.
Exactly. Mill argues that women, like enslaved people, they're denied agency, the ability to make their own choices, control their own lives.
I see.
They're also denied autonomy, the freedom to act independently, not be subject to the will of others.
Okay, so I'm starting to see the connection.
Hmm.
But wasn't slavery, I mean, on a whole other level of brutality? How could he even compare the two?
Well, yeah, it's a fair point. And Mill, he does acknowledge the differences, of course, but he also highlights this unique form of oppression that women face.
Okay, what do you mean?
This constant pressure to conform to societal expectations, to please men, to seek power through, these indirect means.
So he's saying women are trapped in these social norms and expectations, limiting their freedom, just like chains would.
That's a powerful way to put it. He calls women a subject class, meaning they are literally subject to the authority of men.
And that's a problem for everyone.
A huge one, he argues. This subjection, he says, it's a chief hindrance to human improvement.
Wow. So it's not just about women suffering then.
No, it's bigger than that. He's saying society as a whole, we all suffer when women are denied their full potential.
That's a powerful statement.
Yeah.
So women's equality isn't just about fairness then.
Not just. It's essential, he argues, for the progress of all humanity. And for those of you prepping for the UPSC,
Yeah.
this is a key takeaway. Mill's arguments, they go beyond simple moral appeals. He's making a logical case here. Women's equality is not just right, it's necessary for a thriving society.
Okay, so we've got this radical comparison to slavery, this idea of women as a subject class, denied agency and autonomy, holding everyone back. Where does he go from there?
Well, he takes on one of the most fundamental institutions of his time,
What's that?
marriage.
Yes, marriage.
Not exactly the romantic ideal for Mill, though.
Oh, why not?
He saw marriage, at least in Victorian England, as a prime example of women's subordination.
Okay, unpack that a bit. What was so problematic about marriage?
Well, for starters, he argued that women were often forced into it, purely for economic survival.
Ah, I see. Limited options to support themselves, so marriage was the only viable path.
Exactly. And once they were married, they lost all legal standing.
Wait, lost their legal standing? What does that even mean?
They were no longer considered independent persons under the law, couldn't own property, control their earnings, not even legal custody of their children.
That's pretty bleak. So marriage wasn't about love and partnership.
Not in the way Mill saw it. No, it was about economic dependence and legal subjugation. And remember, this is a time when liberal ideas, individual rights, they're gaining momentum.
Right.
So Mill's critique of marriage, it really hit a nerve.
He's basically saying, if we're serious about liberty, we need to extend it to the family, too.
Right. He goes even further, arguing that traditional marriage actually undermines the development of both men and women.
How so?
It teaches men to be domineering and women to be submissive. Harmful, he thought, to individual character and to social progress.
Not exactly a recipe for a happy relationship, then.
Not in Mill's eyes. But he wasn't just a critic. He actually offered a different vision for marriage. A compassionate marriage, he called it.
Compassionate marriage.
Yeah.
Was he talking about, like, free love, open relationships?
Not exactly. Still believed in monogamy and commitment. But this marriage would be based on mutual respect, intellectual equality.
Interesting.
A true partnership where both partners could develop their talents, pursue their interests, both inside and outside the home.
A marriage between equals. That's pretty revolutionary for the Victorian era.
It was. And remember, Mill wasn't just theorizing, he was actively fighting for legal reforms to make this a reality.
Like what?
Equal property rights for women, control over their own earnings, guaranteeing their legal standing as individuals.
So this wasn't just an abstract debate for him. He wanted real change in the lives of women.
Absolutely. Legal equality was the foundation for any meaningful progress. And for those of you thinking about the UPSC, this is where it gets super relevant. Mill's ideas about marriage and legal reform, they've had a lasting impact. Think about international human rights law, the global movement for gender equality.
Okay, so we've got Mill comparing women to the enslaved. He's critiquing traditional marriage, demanding legal reforms. He was serious about this. But didn't he also hold some pretty traditional views about women's roles?
Well, that's where it gets complicated, and it's something we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, UPSC aspirants, stay tuned.
Yeah, so it's true. Mill's views on women's roles, they weren't always, perfectly progressive.
Oh, no way.
For example, he kind of envisioned a family structure where men were the primary breadwinners, and women, they'd focus on home and children.
So on one hand, he's pushing for legal equality, intellectual development, but on the other, he's holding on to these traditional ideas.
Yeah, it seems a bit contradictory, right?
It does. How do we make sense of that?
Well, historical context is key here. Remember, 19th century, separate spheres for men and women. Those were deeply ingrained in society. Even with their limitations, Mill's ideas, they were considered radical for the time.
I guess so. Maybe he was trying to push for change, but without, completely alienating everyone.
It's possible he was a pragmatist, Understood that social change happens gradually, pushing too far too fast.
Could backfire.
Exactly.
But how do we reconcile these, seemingly traditional views with his broader arguments about equality, agency, all that?
Well, even within this framework of separate spheres, Mill advocated for genuine choice. For women, I mean.
Okay, so women could focus on domestic life if they wanted to.
Yes, but that choice, it had to be made freely, not out of economic necessity or social pressure.
So it's not about dictating roles,
Right.
but making sure women have the freedom to choose.
Exactly. And that brings us to another key aspect of his thought.
What's that?
Education. He was a huge advocate for women's education, essential, he said, for intellectual development and to participate fully in society.
Makes sense. Education empowers people, right?
Yep.
To think critically, challenge things.
Right. All crucial if you're trying to dismantle inequality. Mill believed education was the key to breaking down prejudice, to truly appreciating equality.
So if men and women were educated to value reason, critical thinking, autonomy.
Exactly. The foundations of patriarchy would crumble.
Powerful stuff. So education isn't just about acquiring knowledge. It's about transforming minds.
Beautifully put. And for you UPSC folks, this is relevant. Mill's ideas about education, they're directly linked to current debates. Gender equality, development, human rights.
Okay, we can't forget about Mill's economic views.
True. He wrote Principles of Political Economy after all.
Right. Not just some armchair philosopher.
He recognized that economic independence was crucial for women's liberation.
That makes sense. Economic dependence can be a huge barrier to freedom, right?
Absolutely. Relying on someone else financially, you're less likely to challenge them, assert your independence.
And Mill saw this happening to women in his time.
He did. Denied access to education and jobs, leaving them vulnerable, dependent on men.
But didn't Mill also suggest that if women had true equality at home, they might choose to focus on domestic life?
He did. It's one of the more, debated aspects of his thought. He believed in women's right to work, absolutely, but he also recognized that many women, if given a real choice, they might prefer family life.
I see. But wouldn't that reinforce traditional gender roles?
He was aware of that risk, for sure, but his argument was true equality means letting women choose, even if those choices aren't what he personally preferred.
Okay, so it's about respecting those individual choices.
Exactly. Forcing women into the workforce, even with good intentions, could be just as oppressive as denying them the opportunity to work.
It's about balance then, recognizing there's no one-size-fits-all approach to equality.
That's a great way to sum it up. Mill understood that genuine equality wasn't about imposing a vision, but creating conditions for women to choose freely, to have the same opportunities as men, whatever path they take.
So we've covered a lot here. The comparisons to slavery, the critique of marriage, the emphasis on education, economic independence, and of course, the complexities of his views on women's roles.
A lot to unpack, but incredibly relevant, when you say. For understanding liberal thought, its implications for gender equality. And for our listeners thinking about the UPSC, this is gold.
Right.
Mill's ideas are likely to come up. Essays, interviews. A solid grasp of his arguments is essential.
He provides a framework for thinking about these issues. Gender, power, the kind of society we want.
Precisely. And remember, Mill wasn't just talking. He was active in reform movements, campaigned for women's suffrage, advocated for legal changes, used his writing to challenge the status quo.
Putting his ideas into action, not just theorizing.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even facing huge inequality, individuals can make a difference.
Inspiring. So these ideas, they did have a real-world impact.
That's a great question, and one we'll tackle in the final part of our deep dive. We'll look at Mill's legacy, how his ideas are still shaping the conversation about gender equality today.
So, back to Mill's impact. Did his ideas actually make a difference? Out there in the real world, I mean.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just some intellectual exercise for him. He really wanted to see change happen. And his work, it really did play a big part in pushing for women's rights, both back then and even now.
Give us some examples. What kind of impact are we talking about?
Well, think about the suffrage movement. You know, women getting the right to vote.
Huge.
His writing helped fuel that movement. His arguments about women's intelligence, their right to participate in public life.
It gave the movement a strong foundation.
It did. It made it much harder to deny women a voice in politics.
I see. So he helped shift the conversation.
He did. And it wasn't just politics. His work also influenced legal reforms, ones that directly improved the lives of women.
Like what?
Well, his arguments about property rights, for instance,
Okay.
they paved the way for laws that gave women more control over their earnings, their assets.
So he was challenging the legal structures that kept women down.
Exactly. And beyond the legal stuff, his writing also contributed to this, well, this broader cultural shift, you know, how people viewed women.
How so?
His arguments about women's intellectual and moral equality, they really challenged those traditional gender roles.
Yeah.
It created a more open environment for women to pursue education, to enter professions, basically to participate more fully in the world.
Wow. It's amazing to think that one person's ideas could have such a ripple effect.
The power of ideas, right? They can transcend time and place and inspire generations. And Mill's ideas, they're still very much alive today.
Wait, really? It's been, what, over 150 years since he wrote The Subjection of Women? Haven't we moved past all that by now?
Well, the world has changed, that's for sure. But a lot of the issues Mill was wrestling with, they're still with us. We're still debating gender roles, work-life balance, how to achieve true equality.
So we're still having the same arguments that Mill was having way back then.
In a lot of ways, yes. And that's why his work is still so important. It gives us a framework for thinking critically about these issues, for understanding where this inequality comes from, and for imagining a better, more just future.
Okay, so let's bring it back to our UPSC preppers. What are the key takeaways here? How can they use Mill to their advantage in the exam?
Well, first and foremost, they've got to have a solid grasp of Mill's core arguments in the subjection of women. They need to know his points about women's subordination, his critique of marriage, his emphasis on education and economic independence. You know, that vision of a more equal society.
So don't just skim the surface.
Yeah.
Really dive deep into the text.
Exactly. And then think about how those arguments apply today to current issues.
I see. Like how?
Well, for example, how would Mill think about gender quotas in government, you know, based on his ideas about women's political representation?
Interesting.
Or think about girls' education in developing countries. How do his views on education relate to that?
It's about making those connections, showing the examiners you can apply the theory to the real world.
That's it. And don't be afraid to be critical of Mill, too. Acknowledge the limitations of his views, especially about women's roles in the family.
Right.
Talk about how his ideas have been both embraced and challenged by later feminist thinkers.
So show them you can think for yourself, not just repeat what you've read.
Exactly. Remember, the UPSC, they're looking for critical thinkers, people who can analyze, articulate their ideas, and engaging deeply with Mill. That can really help you hone those skills.
Awesome. So there you have it, future diplomats. A deep dive into John Stuart Mill and the subjection of women.
We've explored his radical arguments, the historical context, and the lasting impact on the fight for equality.
We hope you found this deep dive insightful and, well, maybe even a bit inspiring.
And remember, like Mill believed, progress is possible, but it takes constant effort, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge injustice wherever we see it.
So go out there and make Mill proud. And don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more UPSC insights. Hit that like button and share with your fellow aspirants. Until next time, happy studying.